My name is Elias Vance, and I no longer give a damn what reason dictates. The Harlequins are real. I call them Harlequins, not clowns, because the word clown implies a circus, a jest, a mere mockery of entertainment. What hunts us is not an entertainer. It is an emissary of an ancient, festering malignancy, and the name Harlequin, derived from the demonic folklore of the Commedia dell'arte, feels infinitely more appropriate. I know this because my friends and I were almost killed by some of them 3 years ago in the wretched pine forests of Blackwood Cove. Everyone thinks that this global wave of eerie clown sightings, the masked figures lurking on the roadside, the ominous whispers from the woods, the stolen children, the pets reduced to bone and gristle, is a viral phenomenon born of a modern horror film, or perhaps just a collective sociological hysteria spurred by anonymous pranksters with too much spare time and cheap latex masks. They are all wrong, and I have spent every waking moment since that October night assembling the cold, terrifying truth that proves them so. The stunts and the brief flurries of masked madness that plague the news cycle are merely the surface ripples of something vast, deep, and horrifyingly persistent. This phenomenon is not something that began with a movie release or even a few decades ago with isolated incidents. Hell, the documented history of this cult, and yes, it is an organized, clandestine cult, stretches back at least 7 centuries, based on the obscure texts I've managed to locate and partially translate. I've recently found evidence suggesting that this Jocular Order, as I've come to name them, has roots that predate the formal structure of the Roman Catholic Church, reaching back into the feral pagan rituals of the late Iron Age. Their sightings and the vile criminal activities that coincide with them are not random acts of vandalism. They are acts of worship, liturgical violence designed to herald something the texts call Cordon. Most of what I've learned suggests a distant, cold, and inhuman beginning for all of this, and it comes directly from books I had to go find in the darkest, dustiest corners of private occult bookstores and the restricted sections of university libraries. There is almost nothing reliable left online. Online research isn't reliable for a multitude of reasons, but on this specific subject, it is a deliberate act of obfuscation. Someone or some powerful group is actively and systematically removing the historical evidence of the Harlequin phenomenon. I have literally watched it happen in near real time. I'll locate a digitized account of some clown-related happening pre-1980s, download it, and go to share the link only to find later that the entire archive page has been scrubbed, or the host site has vanished under a server error 404 screen. This has happened at least 7 times now, with shared accounts from the physical books I've read being removed from the public domain. It's like a meticulous librarian of the macabre doesn't want anyone to connect the dots. Any mention of these occurrences before the 1960s seems to be automatically flagged for removal. But at any rate, I am now terrifyingly well-versed in what I've gloomily dubbed Harlequin lore, a subject I never expected to know anything about, but which became an all-consuming obsession after the horror that unfolded in 2021. At the time, I was a naive, slightly arrogant mythology student living in Blackwood Cove, Maine. It's a town deliberately designed by nature to be forgotten. Remote, isolated, cradled by vast, unforgiving forests of pine and spruce, and perpetually shrouded in the chill fog that rolls in off the Atlantic. We were only a 2-hour drive from Portland, but culturally we felt centuries removed. My friends and I, Finn, Sarah, and I were, by all outward measures, normal. We went to the local community college, drove the coast roads, and spent too much time arguing over obscure fantasy lore. I don't think any of us can claim the label of normal anymore. We used to waste afternoons playing tactical video games, hiking the desolate trails, and trying, mostly failing, to navigate the complexities of dating in a town with a declining population. The whole thing started around the end of September that year. Blackwood Cove had always prided itself on its isolation and low crime rate. The big national clown sightings from 5 or 6 years prior had been a distant, almost comical memory. No one ever expected the creeping rot to reach our fog-choked shores. Finn O'Connell was the first to hear about it. a whisper from a gas station attendant about a shadowy figure spotted near the abandoned cannery. He told Sarah and me that night while we were trying to beat a notoriously difficult dungeon crawl. "They're here, guys. Clowns. Or whatever you call them now," Finn murmured, his voice tight. Sarah, who was homeschooled and relied more on us for local gossip than the internet, hadn't heard a thing. I, being the resident expert on weirdness, tried to dismiss it, though the pit in my stomach was already forming. I'd researched the 2016 phenomenon extensively, and the initial wave of sightings always seemed to be the prelude to something worse. The initial reports were innocuous, almost easy to dismiss as kids on an edgy Halloween trend. 2 distinct sightings of figures in grotesque, mismatched attire coming out of the dense pine thickets near the old logging trails. The first 2 sightings involved individuals in wildly different costumes. One a traditional Pierrot with exaggerated tears, the other a patchwork figure, like a discarded scarecrow. Locals, steeped in the skepticism of rural life, insisted it was one person changing outfits, looking for cheap thrills. Before the night of the attack, my friends and I echoed this belief, half-jokingly speculating they were psychos who'd watched too much true crime. Then the reports multiplied. And it wasn't just the quantity, but the quality of the witnesses that dragged the dread from the realm of pranks into the cold light of terror. The first official police report that shook the town came from an elderly lighthouse keeper, a woman known for her unwavering sobriety and sharp mind. She reported seeing 2 figures loitering at the very edge of her property where the yard met the terrifying, black-toothed line of the woods. She claimed they came out at night, moving with a stilted, unnatural gait, and this detail chilled me. They were whistling. Not a tune, but a high, thin, piercing sound that she described as sounding like a kettle about to boil over. A few days after her report, her faithful sheepdog, an animal too large and too aggressive to be snatched by any ordinary predator, vanished. Then the other disappearances began. It wasn't just pets. Across Blackwood Cove, cats, small farm animals, and even a prize-winning show rabbit disappeared without a trace. The silent, unsettling horror was becoming palpable. The next significant sighting took place near the old maritime beacon, a massive, decommissioned lighthouse. The witness, a tourist couple passing through, reported seeing a disconcerting number of figures dressed in clown costumes, at least half a dozen. According to the report the couple filed, before they packed their bags and fled Maine forever, these individuals approached their car and began gesturing violently, trying to force them to exit the vehicle. The husband, momentarily thinking it was a twisted road show, almost complied until he saw one of the Harlequins was carrying something long, glinting, and wickedly sharp. They sped away, shaken to their core. To the credit of the Blackwood Cove Police Department, while small and utterly unequipped for this kind of coordinated psychological warfare, they took the sightings seriously. This sort of focused, disturbing criminal activity simply never happened in our town. We had, and still have, virtually zero violent crime. But the disappearances, particularly the missing animals, were turning local fear into panic. Police Chief Leeds, a formidable, granite-faced man, camped out near the lighthouse and a few other reported hot spots. Nothing ever came of it. I did hear a rumor that the police actually spotted some figures and chased them into the woods, but they vanished instantly, moving through the undergrowth with inhuman speed. Knowing Leeds, I couldn't imagine him letting them go easily. He'd probably been ready to shoot one of them, and given what I know now, I wouldn't blame him. These terrifying sightings continued well into October, ramping up heavily as Halloween approached. The hopeful locals clung to the belief that it was all just an elaborate, albeit cruel, prank designed to ruin the season. That hope died when Mrs. Carol Winston, the school secretary, was chased into the 57 diesel station by a Harlequin. It wasn't just a brief pursuit. The figure slammed repeatedly against the locked glass door as she and the manager huddled inside. It was a deliberate, violent display of menace. Chief Leeds finally enacted a mandatory curfew of 8 p.m. There was serious talk of canceling trick-or-treating altogether, which left a toxic, fearful atmosphere hanging over the town. My own personal story, the moment my mythology research crossed into brutal reality, starts on October 21, 2021. Finn, Sarah, and I decided to go to a local zipline course, the abandoned Typhoon Zipline, a place we frequented. Sarah's family lived on Ridgeview Road, and we could hike through the woods near her house in about 20 minutes to get there. It was a decaying tourist attraction, but it was cheap, fun, and remote, so our parents didn't mind. Looking back, knowing what was happening, this choice seems incredibly stupid, but almost all the serious sightings were closer to the town center and the coast. We had done this exact hike 100 times. We knew the path, a barely visible deer trail that snaked through the darkest part of the pines, like the back of our hands. And that intimacy with the woods, that subconscious mapping of the terrain, is probably the only reason we are still alive today. Sarah's mother, bless her heart, had made us lunch that afternoon. I remember it vividly. A thick, perfect ham and cheese sandwich, because I was desperately, pathetically in love with her mother, who always treated us like her own. Anyway, after lunch, we headed out through the backyard. Finn, despite not living there, always led first because he was the one who had originally suggested the route. He was the trailblazer of our group, still is, actually. He went to our start tree, a massive, gorgeous red maple that served as our traditional entry point into the Blackwood. That time of year, its leaves formed a glorious, treacherous carpet of crimson and gold. I remember idly wondering how long that fleeting beauty would last before the inevitable Maine snows covered everything in a desolate white shroud. One of the reasons we stopped at this tree every time was a piece of debris from the distant past. The treehouse Sarah's dad had built when she was small. It had long since collapsed, but we used the salvaged wood to make a storage crate. Inside, we kept our hiking sticks, carved by Sarah's hobbyist woodworker father into amazing, fantastical shapes. Whenever we held them, we felt like three slightly nerdy, hyper-vigilant Gandalfs embarking on an epic quest. We took the trail with speed, fueled by teenage adrenaline, and made it to the monolith, the huge, moss-covered boulder that marked roughly the halfway point. We always stopped here for a breather, partly because we were usually winded, but mostly because the place was awe-inspiring. The boulder was taller than any of us, a dark, primal stone being slowly devoured by the nearby, towering oak tree. It was the perfect spot to sit, rest, or, if you were Finn, climb. Finn, buzzing with energy, scaled the rock the moment we hit the clearing. We sat there and chatted idly about school, about the latest updates to our game, and a girl who had moved onto Sarah's street. We were just shooting the breeze, truly. We had only been talking for about 5 minutes when we all heard it. Something came from the other side of the massive rock. We immediately fell silent, straining to identify the sound. After a moment of absolute stillness, someone on the other side of the rock giggled. It was the sound of a man, and it was unnaturally loud, cutting through the dense silence of the forest like a piece of glass. Finn spun around on his perch atop the rock, while Sarah and I circled around the base to see who it was. The thought of the Harlequins didn't even register in my mind. I just assumed it was other kids, maybe even some college students, and in the pathetic, simple-minded focus of a 16-year-old, I hoped there were girls. But when we got to the other side of the monolith, there was no one there. We could still hear the giggling. It was coming from the tree line to the north, clear as a bell, yet distant. When I heard the sound again, really heard it, the realization of what it was or what it heralded struck me like a physical blow. The giggling wasn't joyful. It was a sick, cold sound, like dry leaves being dragged across concrete. I was afraid. I instinctively pulled Sarah back behind the boulder and urged Finn to get down, but he refused, his gaze locked on the shadows of the tree line. The giggling persisted for a moment more, then slowly, deliberately, it drifted off, growing fainter as it moved further north into the impenetrable depths of the pines. We sat there, frozen, listening until the sound was finally swallowed by the vast silence of Blackwood. Finn looked down at us, confused and nervous, but I just gave a shuddering sigh and said the only thing that felt right. Those damn Harlequins. I want to pause here, just as I did that day, to mention the research that this seemingly random event triggered. My discovery of the Lidibrium Obscurum, the dark mockery, was only weeks away. A Latin text detailing bizarre cult rituals involving motley paint and the mocking of victims. But the detail that mattered most, the one that echoed in the forest that day, was the risus tenebrarum, the laughter of darkness. It is a laughter that emanates from a darkened or shadowed place beyond sight. A cave, an unlit ruin, or the shadowed boughs of a dense forest like the one we were in. The text claimed this laughter was the harbinger or herald of Cordon, the entity whose name in Latin is simply clown, but which the text derives from an earlier Greek name meaning crested lark, battle-ready, and companion. I still don't know the connection, but the cold dread that laughter instilled was absolutely supernatural. It wasn't a prank. It was a summons. We stayed by the monolith for a few minutes longer, waiting for the sound to return, but the silence remained absolute. Finn was tense, but Sarah and I just wanted to get to the zip line, to find something normal and fun to anchor ourselves. We hurried him off the rock and pushed forward. Honestly, at that point, I just wanted to be around people who weren't standing in the woods, laughing ominously. The rest of the journey was uneventful, perhaps because we didn't speak for the 10 minutes it took to reach the zipline course. We paid our fee and took our time doing the course, partially to delay heading back through the woods. We lingered at the old, dusty pop shop on the property for half an hour, trying to flirt with the older girl behind the counter, who gently turned me down, as always. Finally, we couldn't justify waiting any longer. We had to start back to Sarah's house. I briefly considered suggesting the road, but the highway was dark, dangerous, and illegal to walk on. We all knew, on some unspoken level, that we had to return the way we came. We never acknowledged the laughter again, outside of my initial curse. We didn't discuss the collective fear that was simmering beneath our skin. We walked back with a primal tension, like prey sensing a shift in the air, but still only in the back of our minds did we actually expect something to happen. Whatever small hope we had of making it back without incident was shattered the moment we reached the clearing of the monolith again. The sun was sinking, and the clearing was already cloaked in deep, oppressive shadows. Before I could even suggest blazing straight through, Finn shouted a curse, a raw, strangled sound that ripped the silence. I looked up to see what he was staring at, and the sudden, sickening realization of the horror before us almost made me vomit. The entire back of our little hangout boulder, where moments ago there had been only rock and moss, was completely smeared in fresh-looking, deep red blood. And on top of it, arranged like a grotesque offering, were 3 pristine, almost white animal skulls. One was a large domestic dog, one a cat, and one looked unmistakably like the distinct, pushed-in profile of a pug, immediately flashing to my mind the missing pet of the elderly lighthouse keeper. Finn spun around, his hiking staff raised defensively, expecting us to be ambushed. Sarah shakily pulled out her phone, trying to call her mother. I was simply frozen, staring at the logistics of the display. Could we have missed the blood on our original pass? It was impossible. This meant the entire display had been set up in the time we were at the zipline, a maximum of 90 minutes. It was deliberate, performative, and set with the sole purpose of shocking us to our core. As though in direct response to my internal terror and bewilderment, the laughter echoed out into the clearing again. But this time it was coming from the other side of the monolith. Whoever was out there was now between us and our way back to the safety of Sarah's house. The trail home was blocked. I snapped out of my confusion, gripping my carved staff tightly and holding it up defensively, just as Finn roared out for whoever it was to show themselves. And they did. The figure stepped out from behind the towering stone, the shifting evening light catching the synthetic gleam of its costume. It was the first of the Harlequins, and the sight of it instantly wiped away any lingering, pathetic hope that this was a fraternity prank or a college student's edgy video project. This was not a joke. This was a manifestation of pure, predatory malice. The Harlequin was dressed head to toe in a patchwork of clashing primary colors: bright blue, garish purple, and blinding yellow, stitched together crudely like a child's nightmarish attempt at a doll. The mask was the kind that scraped against the boundaries of sanity. A porcelain-smooth face frozen in a permanent, impossibly wide evil grin, with cobalt markings streaking downward from the eyes like stylized bloody tears. Tufts of cheap, crimson hair jutted out wildly from the sides of the mask. It wore white gloves, both of which were stained a shocking, visceral red, glistening as fresh blood dries in the cold air. I don't remember what Finn shouted first, drowned out as he was by a primal, guttural scream that erupted from Sarah. My friend, the normally quiet and collected Sarah, went completely manic, shrieking for her mother, for the police, for anyone, the sound piercing the fragile silence of the Blackwood. Then, from behind us, another voice joined the chaos. A second Harlequin appeared from the shadows of a massive pine, mirroring Sarah's panic. This one was larger, heavier set, dressed in dingy, graying checks, like a forgotten mime costume left to rot in a basement. It approached us slowly, holding its large, pale hands up in an exaggerated, mocking gesture of appeasement, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It mimicked Sarah's distressed cries, a high, mocking wail that only fueled her mounting hysteria. I was paralyzed. A block of ice formed around my chest cavity. I genuinely thought I was going to lose control of my bladder, yet the academic, research-driven part of my brain was already cataloging the details. Two figures, different costumes, coordinated behavior, focused on psychological terror. The second figure, the Sentinel, as I would later name it in my notes for its rigid, watching stance, jerked its head violently towards me, startling me. I stumbled back a step, but held my ground, staff raised. In that terrifying moment, an ember of protective fury ignited within me. I was well aware of my fear, but I refused to let this grotesque thing hurt my friends. The simple, fierce knowledge that I would stand in their way was a strange source of courage. Through the eye-holes of the Sentinel's mask, I saw his eyes. They were hideously bloodshot, veined with sickly yellow, wild and unfocused. The eyes of a man who hadn't slept for a week or was high on something synthetic and savage. Finn roared again, a sound closer to a bear than a teenager, demanding they let us pass. They responded only with a chorus of high-pitched, inhuman laughter, which danced unsettlingly on the edge of the risus tenebrarum. I quickly ran the mental math. 3 of us, 2 of them. We had heavy hiking sticks. They looked unarmed, or so I hoped. We could push through. But then, the third figure stepped out from behind a thick cluster of low-hanging cedar boughs. A woman. She sent a cold spike of dread through my spine that surpassed the terror of the first 2 combined. Her clothes were ancient, stained with what looked like rust and dirt, but recognizably a harlequin's motley. Her mask was the most unsettling of all. Crafted not from cheap plastic but from stitched, aged canvas and dark, hardened leather, giving her face a terrifying, fixed grin that stretched too wide. She was the mocker, the one whose cruel cheerfulness would haunt my nightmares for years. But it wasn't her appearance that shattered my innocence. It was whose hand she was holding. As the mocker emerged, she dragged along a small child, a girl no older than 8. The girl wore a purple jumper and jeans, but no coat against the October chill. Her face and hands were smeared with dirt and pine sap, and she was sobbing uncontrollably, her body limp with exhaustion and raw terror. My focus shifted instantly, violently, from fighting to protecting. The implications of her presence were immediate and profound. This wasn't about scaring teenagers. This was about something vile and criminal. I felt the last shreds of my childhood naivete flake away. "Lily!" Sarah screamed, her own hysteria instantly replaced by pure, desperate recognition. "Lily Sorensen, what have you done to her?" Lily, the girl, tried to bolt towards Sarah, but the mocker's grip on her small wrist was fast and unyielding. Sarah screamed at them not to hurt the girl. The Harlequins remained silent, their movements stilled, watching the chaos they had engineered. Finn demanded they release Lily and let us pass. Finally, the mocker spoke. Her voice was utterly incongruous with the mask she wore. High-pitched, melodic, and sickeningly cheerful, like a children's television host. The sound was so jarringly normal, so saccharine, that it gave me a fleeting, dizzying moment of hope that this was impossibly some elaborate sick joke. "Oh, we won't lay a finger on the little companion," the mocker sang, her voice echoing sweetly through the clearing. "But you will. One of you, anyway." The false cheer dropped away, replaced by a cold, resonant menace. "The way is open, but only one of you may pass without payment. You may take the companion, but first, one must suffer the dark jest." As if to punctuate this monstrous demand, the mocker produced a weapon, not a cheap imitation, but a genuine, wicked-looking medieval dagger, its guard carved with intricate, unsettling spirals. The other two Harlequins mirrored her action. The sentinel near Finn produced a heavy, dull ball-peen hammer, gripping the handle with both gloved hands. The grinner, the one closest to me, pulled out a jagged, rusted kitchen knife, its blade catching the dim light. They were no longer mere threats. They were executioners waiting for a choice. The mocker remained still and chillingly composed, but the sentinel and the grinner shifted their weight, their postures taut, radiating an eagerness for violence, like hounds straining at the leash. I felt a dizzying surge of panic. I was ready to offer myself up immediately, but the cold logic of my mythology major kicked in. If I volunteered, who was lurking in the woods to snatch Lily the moment we dropped our guard? The monolith was their stage, but the forest was their entire theater. While I struggled to formulate a desperate, logical plan, to buy time to negotiate, Finn, bless his impulsive, furious heart, had already decided that he wasn't submitting to this vile transaction. With a primal yell born of terror and rage, he launched his carved hiking staff. It was a spear, guided by sheer adrenaline, and it flew with deadly accuracy, striking the mocker hard in the center of her chest. The impact was shocking. The mocker was blasted backward, hitting the base of the monolith with a heavy, sickening thud, dropping Lily's wrist in the process. "Run! Grab Lily and run!" Finn roared, already rotating his body to meet the sentinel's charge. Sarah didn't hesitate. She bolted straight for the freed girl. The grinner, realizing the window of opportunity was closing, lunged forward and snatched at Sarah's collar, pulling the rusted blade up in a wide, erratic arc. I swung my staff with all my strength, aiming for the grinner's head. He was unnaturally fast, jerking his head back just enough for the staff to whistle past his face, forcing him to release Sarah's shirt. Sarah scooped Lily into her arms. The child was light, almost skeletal, and tore ass around the far side of the monolith, disappearing into the deepening gloom of the escape trail. Then the grinner was on me. He came in low and fast, the rusty knife flashing. My desperate attempt at protection was over. I was alone, facing a psycho who wanted nothing more than to carve me up. The world contracted to the space between me and the jagged, poisoned steel. I panicked, stumbling backward, weakly jabbing my staff as a defense. I heard Finn cursing violently behind me, the heavy thud of the hammer, and Sarah's fading, desperate cry, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure lunging at me. The grinner wasn't just laughing anymore. He was hissing and growling, a terrifying cacophony of human and animal noise. His eyes, visible through the mask, were huge, dilated, and consumed by a terrifying, boundless bloodlust. He absolutely wanted to kill me. I was certain of it. His final, wide, clumsy lunge caught me. Not the knife, but the handle struck my temple with blinding force. I yelped, lost my balance, and tripped violently over a massive, exposed tree root. I fell hard onto my side, landing with my full weight on my heavy wooden staff. I heard a sharp crack, the staff snapped cleanly in two, and a blinding jolt of pain shot through my ribs. The Harlequin was on me in an instant. He scrambled atop my chest, pinning me to the cold, damp earth. His gloved fingers, stained dark red, closed around my neck, instantly cutting off my desperate, gasping breath. The jagged knife was brandished high above my eyes, reflecting the last rays of the dying sun. And he laughed. A cold, pure, menacing glee that was the epitome of the risus tenebrarum. I thrashed wildly, struggling against the iron grip. I was drowning on dry land, the world turning a sickly, blurry shade of green. I was certain I was going to die, and the last sensation I would ever experience would be this sick bastard's triumph. Through the tightening pressure on my throat, I heard his voice. No longer a laugh, but a harsh, wet whisper close to my ear. Why aren't you laughing? Don't you think this is funny, little scholar? Don't you think the dark jest is a wonderful gift? He paused, leaning closer, the knife beginning its slow descent. Please laugh for me, the grinner whispered, his voice cracking with a terrifying neediness that transcended murder. If you don't laugh, then we have to kill you. And I'm so lonely in the dark. The blue sky visible through the canopy began to dim, flickering into the periphery of my vision. I struggled to process his insane plea, lonely in the dark, but coherent thought was slipping away. Then, a sudden, blinding flash of pure, animalistic survival instinct ripped through the fog of asphyxiation. My father's old pocket knife, the one I always kept in the lower, zippered pocket of my cargo pants. I came back to reality for one desperate, agonizing second, squirming and bucking against his weight. My hands scrabbled in the thick fabric, found the solid, cold metal, and whipped it out. I fumbled to snap the blade open. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, I drove the blade upward, blindly, aiming for the soft underbelly. The blade connected with a sickening, wet thud. Not the softness I expected, but the hard, bony structure of his ribcage. The Harlequin screamed. A sound of pure, shocked agony, far more human than his laughter. His grip immediately loosened, and he pitched backward off my chest. I heard a heavy, choked cough as he fell onto the damp earth. Gasping, choking, and dragging air into my burning lungs, I immediately began to crawl away from him, ignoring the searing pain in my ribs. I grabbed a fistful of the root that had tripped me, pulling myself upright. I stumbled back to the clearing, weak and dizzy, just in time to see Finn, his own face contorted with exertion and terror, standing over the sentinel. Finn was holding a small, silver-bladed pocket hatchet, a tool he used for clearing small brush on the trail, which I hadn't realized he had on him. The sentinel was on the ground, unmoving. A deep, impossible gash sliced across his forehead. Yet, oddly, there was no blood. On the far side of the monolith, the mocker was slowly, deliberately rising to her feet, the staff Finn threw embedded deep in her tattered costume. Then, I looked behind me. The grinner, whom I had certainly stabbed through 2 ribs, was already struggling back to his feet. I had stabbed him with a knife that was sharp, but Finn's hatchet was sharper. Yet Finn's victim was still. The grinner was not. There was no blood on him. None. The massive wound I had inflicted, which should have been pumping life onto the forest floor, was dry. Only the thin, pulsing crimson from the cut on my own temple testified to the reality of the fight. "Elias," Run! Finn screamed, pointing desperately down the trail Sarah and Lily had taken. I bolted. I ran past the fallen sentinel, confirming my horror. The man was dead, his skull cleaved open, yet the wound was oddly clean, dark and bloodless. As I passed the monolith, the mocker let out an insane, high-pitched shriek of pure maternal rage and took off in pursuit. I ran with the desperation of a wounded animal, pumping my legs as hard as I could, focusing only on the distant sound of Sarah and Lily. Finn, always the faster runner, was already well ahead of me, but he kept looking back, ensuring I was still on my feet. Far ahead of him, I glimpsed Sarah, the fastest of us all, carrying Lily and running like a demon was on her heels. At least they would get away. That thought was the only anchor to sanity I had left. The mocker was gaining on me. I looked back occasionally, catching glimpses of her pale, stitched mask between the pines. She wasn't running so much as gliding, covering ground with an unnatural, terrifying efficiency. Her laughter and screaming, "Come back to the dark. It is lonely. You must laugh," were closer now, a physical presence at my back. I resolved to hold her off, to ensure the others reached safety, even if it meant giving myself up to the dark jest. But just as she closed the distance to less than 5 feet, I heard it. A sound of salvation, the voice of the only adult who mattered. "Seraphina! Elias! Finn!" Sarah's mother, Mrs. Dubois, was calling out from the edge of the woods. The sound of a human voice, strong and maternal, gave me a sudden, blinding burst of renewed energy. It was a lifeline. It also seemed to affect the mocker. She stumbled, her unearthly speed instantly dropping. I reached the massive red maple, our start tree, and the wooden crate where we kept our hiking supplies. I turned, adrenaline blinding the pain, and grabbed the thickest piece of scrap wood I could find. A 2x4 salvaged from the old treehouse. I raised it, ready to swing. The mocker had stopped. She backed away significantly, her entire posture shifting into one of defeat and disappointment. She dropped her dagger hand and reached out to me with the other, her voice now a heartbroken, desolate whine. "Please come back to the dark with us," she whimpered mournfully, her hands stretching out desperately through the gloom. "We can play forever in the dark. It is so much funnier here." She stomped the ground and plunged her dagger wildly into the dirt in frustration. But as I continued to back away towards the safety of Sarah's yard and the overwhelming light from the house, she let out a final, insane howl of pure loss. Then, she turned and bolted, disappearing back into the Blackwood towards the monolith, leaving only the fading echo of her heartbreaking, terrible laughter behind. The transition from the wild, panicked flight in the shadowed forest to the brightly lit, sterile normalcy of Sarah's kitchen was less a rescue and more a violent, disorienting tear in reality. We tumbled out of the darkness and into the embrace of Mrs. Dubois, who, despite her own terror, possessed the kind of granite calm that defines survivalists in remote Maine. She pushed us inside, securing the heavy wooden door with 3 separate locks and immediately activating the house alarm. She had already called 911, and the sirens were already a faint, distant wail against the silence of the woods. The scene was pure, frantic chaos. Sarah was curled on the floor, holding Lily Sorensen like a shield, rocking her back and forth, whispering soft, incoherent reassurances. Lily, meanwhile, was silent, utterly vacant. She wasn't crying anymore. She was just staring blankly at the ceiling, her eyes huge, black pools of terror. I was leaning against the kitchen counter, fighting to control the spasms of pain in my chest and the dizzying nausea that rolled over me every time I opened my eyes. My neck was already throbbing violently where the grinner's fingers had locked, and the cut above my temple was bleeding sluggishly, dripping onto the pristine white tile floor. Finn was pacing. He was the most physically intact, having suffered only minor scrapes and bruises, but the trauma was etched into the tight lines around his eyes. He kept repeating the same phrase over and over in a low, furious murmur. "I killed one of them. I killed one of the bastards." Mrs. Du Bois, after checking on Lily and Sarah, turned her attention to me, gently dabbing the blood from my head. "Elias, focus. Who was it? Did you recognize them? This isn't just a prank, is it?" she asked, her voice low and steady. I tried to explain, tried to put words to the cold, dead eyes of the sentinel and the sick, desperate whisper of the grinner. But all that came out was a choking, breathless garble. Not human, Mrs. Du Bois. The laugh. The mocker. She wanted us to play. Mrs. Du Bois's face tightened. She knew I wasn't talking about a game. She knew I was talking about the folklore, the cult studies she'd sometimes indulge me in. But before she could press me further, the sound of car doors slamming outside heralded the arrival of the police. Chief Leeds and the Lie of Necessity. Chief Leeds was the first into the house, followed by two young officers who looked pale and bewildered. Leeds took one look at the sheer, raw terror radiating from the four of us and instantly understood the gravity of the situation. He was no stranger to violence. Blackwood Cove was small, but he'd seen his share of drunken bar fights and hunting accidents. But this was different. This was vile. He knelt by Lily first, his huge, calloused hand gently touching the girl's shoulder. "Lily Sorensen," he muttered, pulling out his radio. "We have the girl. She's alive, but in shock. We need an ambulance and child services immediately." He then turned his attention to us. His questions were quick, professional, and entirely focused on the mundane. How many were there? What were they wearing? What kind of weapons? We told the truth about the timeline, the monolith, and the horrific demand. But when it came to the core of the why, we censored ourselves instinctively. I didn't tell him about the Ludibrium Obscurum, or the Jocular Order, or the ancient cult rituals. Leeds was a police chief, not a scholar of ancient demonic entities. And Finn and I both agreed, without a single spoken word, to omit the most terrifying detail: the sheer supernatural resistance of the grinner and the plea of the mocker. Finn only reported that he had hit one of the attackers with a heavy tool, and that the man, the sentinel, had fallen and not moved. He made it sound like a chaotic, defensive action, omitting the clean, bloodless nature of the wound. He didn't mention the pocket hatchet, instead claiming to have used a rock in the adrenaline. I simply stated that the grinner had grabbed me, the knife had scratched my ribs in the fall, and he had fled when Mrs. Du Bois arrived. I omitted the strangulation, the dry blade, and the terrifying, needy whisper. "I'm so lonely in the dark." Leeds looked intently at me, his gaze sharp and assessing. "You were attacked, Vance. The knife hit you." "No," I rasped, touching the wound on my temple. "He hit me with the handle, and I fell onto a root. I fought him off." I lied because the truth was impossibly complex. How could I explain that I stabbed a man, a physical human man, with a sharp blade, and that wound vanished as he stood up? That single fact, the fact that my assault seemed to vanish into thin air, was the point where the case crossed from mere murder into the cosmic horror I suspected. I needed to keep that truth private, to study it myself, before I was locked away in a padded room. Leeds didn't press the matter. He accepted the simplified narrative. 3 local thugs in costumes, interrupted mid-kidnapping, one of them mortally wounded by a protective friend. Clean, if grisly, crime. The horror of the monolith. The ambulance took Lily and Sarah to the local hospital. Sarah more for observation and shock treatment than physical injury. Mrs. Du Bois went with them, clutching Sarah's hand as if she feared the Harlequins might snatch her daughter from the hospital bed. Finn and I, after giving our initial statements, insisted on accompanying Leeds and the forensic team back to the monolith. I needed to see the body of the sentinel again. I needed to confirm what I thought I had seen in my panic. The clearing was now a bizarre, unsettling circus of red and blue flashing lights, contrasting violently with the thick, suffocating blackness of the pine forest. The area had been cordoned off with bright yellow tape. Forensic specialists in white hazmat suits moved around the ancient monolith like bizarre, sterile ghosts. As we approached, an officer blocked our path. Leeds waved him aside. "You two stay right here, Vance O'Connell, and keep your mouths shut. Just tell me if anything's been moved." We didn't need to look hard. The crime scene was exactly as we had left it, only now illuminated by powerful floodlights. First, the altar of death. The 3 animal skulls were still resting on the monolith, surrounded by the congealed, sticky blood. The forensic specialist working the area looked physically ill, trying to scrape the substance into sterile vials. Then the corpse. The sentinel was still lying where Finn had dropped him. Seeing him now, under the harsh, unblinking glare of the floodlights, was worse than seeing him in the shadowy, adrenaline-fueled confusion of the fight. The sentinel's body was unervingly still. Finn's hatchet blow had done its work perfectly, splitting the heavy, graying mask and cleaving through the skull beneath. But there was no blood pool. I had been right. The wound was shockingly dark. Where a human corpse should have been surrounded by a slick, expanding circle of arterial blood, the sentinel's wound was black, dry, and seemed to have coagulated instantly upon exposure to the cold air. It wasn't blood. It was more like tar or pitch, crusting around the edges of the wound. I instinctively looked for where the grinner had fallen, expecting to see a knife-sized spot of blood from my own desperate attack, but the damp earth was untouched, clean. The grinner's wound had indeed vanished. A knot of icy terror tightened in my chest. The sentinel was dead, a casualty of Finn's defensive fury, but the grinner was not human, not in any way that mattered. Leeds looked grimly at the body, then at Finn. "You hit him hard, son. You saved your friends' lives and the girls." He paused, frowning slightly. "But I've never seen anything like this." He turned to the forensic specialist, Dr. Hayes, a woman with 40 years of experience in autopsy and crime scene analysis. "What's the status, Doc? Who is he?" Dr. Hayes sighed, pushing her safety goggles onto her forehead. "Chief, I can't tell you. I've bagged the hammer and the dagger, but this subject is unlike anything I've ever processed. Based on musculature and general bone structure, it's a male, mid-30s, maybe, but the clothing is rotten to the touch. It's like old canvas, stiff and fragile." She pointed a gloved finger at the gaping head wound. "Look at the tissue, Chief. The cellular structure is all wrong. It's dehydrated, desiccated. It looks like it hasn't had proper blood circulation for decades. And the blood, what little there is a black, viscous sludge." Dr. Hayes leaned down, taking a deep, hesitant breath near the body. She wrinkled her nose in disgust. "And he smells, Chief, not like decaying flesh. It smells like a tomb, like old dust and sulfur." Finn shifted uncomfortably beside me. I was the only one who seemed to understand the implication. The sulfur smell, the ancient cloth, the lack of fresh blood. The Harlequins were relics, entities tied to a history far deeper and more terrifying than modern crime. Finn's hatchet had done more than kill a man. It had revealed a monstrous, impossible truth. The fact that the body looked old, yet still somehow capable of movement, only confirmed the notes I had already gathered about the Jocular Order. They were emissaries, living or perhaps unliving weapons, existing outside the linear constraints of time. I felt a dizzying surge of intellectual revelation, the kind a scholar feels when a complex hypothesis is brutally proven correct, mixed with the cold, damp terror of knowing that my hypothesis was about supernatural horror. I had to get back to my notes. I had to find the link. Lily, Sarah, and the laughter. Leeds, clearly unnerved by Dr. Hayes' report, decided he needed to talk to the most fragile witness, Lily. He asked me to join him at the hospital, hoping the presence of a younger, familiar face might encourage her to speak. Lily Sorensen was in a pediatric room, sitting up in a massive hospital bed, completely mute. Sarah was asleep in an armchair nearby, having finally succumbed to exhaustion. Leeds sat down by the bed, his voice soft, almost paternal. He asked Lily about the place where she'd been kept. She remained silent, her expression unchanged. He asked about the clowns, the Harlequins, if they had hurt her. Lily's eyes darted frantically, stopping on the large teddy bear on the chair beside her. Lily, what did they do? Did they hit you? Did they hurt you? Leeds insisted gently. Lily, still staring at the teddy bear, raised a tiny, trembling hand. She pointed a single, accusatory finger at the plush toy. Then she finally spoke. It was a faint, broken whisper that sent a new, deeper chill down my spine. They made me listen to the funny sound. The funny sound? You mean their voices, Lily? Leeds asked. Lily shook her head, tears finally tracing silent paths through the dirt on her cheeks. No, the giggle. They locked me in the dark box, and they made me listen to the sound of the laugh. It was so cold. They kept saying I had to laugh too. They said if I didn't laugh, Cordon wouldn't come. The words hit me like a physical blow. The risus tenebrarum. The laughter of darkness. It wasn't a mere ritual. It was a torture device, designed to break the victim's spirit until they offered up the final, cynical, broken laughter demanded by the cult. I looked at the small, shattered girl and realized what the mockers' terrifying desperation was truly about. The Jocular Order was lonely. They weren't looking for victims to sacrifice. They were looking for companions to share their eternal, agonizing dark jest. They wanted someone to descend into their specific brand of madness, to laugh with them in the darkness they inhabited. They didn't want to kill us. They wanted to convert us. I looked at Lily, then at my own hands, recalling the feel of the grinner's desperate, needy fingers around my neck, his terrified whisper of, "I'm so lonely in the dark." It wasn't a threat of murder. It was an invitation to an eternal, horrific existence. The Harlequins were not just serial killers. They were missionaries of madness. Leeds, bewildered, simply thanked the girl and walked out, clearly thinking the Cordon and giggle were symptoms of severe shock. He was a professional investigator, but he wasn't prepared for the occult. I, however, had the academic context. I knew the Sentinel's ancient, sulphurous body was the physical proof. I knew the mockers' heartbroken retreat when confronted by the warmth and light of Mrs. Du Bois was their existential vulnerability. They hated light, they hated life, but they craved companionship in their endless darkness. The Harlequins had vanished entirely after that night. The search, involving state troopers and K-9 units, turned up nothing. No masks, no weapons, no clues to the location of the other two. The monolith was scraped clean, the animal skulls taken into evidence, and the case was officially closed 2 weeks later as an isolated, tragic murder-kidnapping attempt involving 2 unidentified assailants and 1 dead victim of unknown origin. Chief Leeds and Dr. Hayes kept their forensic findings about the Sentinel quiet, filing the report under an archaic code that meant unidentified and anomalous biological sample. The body was sent to a specialized federal lab, never to be seen again. I knew the truth. They had come to Blackwood Cove not to kill, but to recruit. And they would be back. My survival, my knowledge, and my very soul were now tied to the grotesque prophecy of the risus tenebrarum and the coming of Cordon. I left the hospital that night, not as Elias Vance, a student with bruised ribs, but as a traumatized survivor, irrevocably drafted into a secret war against the lonely missionaries of the dark jest. My life was no longer my own. It was a race against the disappearance of ancient texts, against the creeping insanity of the Blackwood, and against the laughter of the malevolent. The events of October 21, 2021, did not end when the Harlequins retreated into the Blackwood. They merely marked the beginning of my new existence. One of paranoia, relentless research, and the constant, chilling awareness of the true, monstrous purpose of the Jocular Order. My physical wounds healed quickly. The bruises on my neck faded, and the ache in my ribs subsided. The internal damage, however, was permanent. I moved out of my parents' home and rented a small, isolated cabin near the community college, creating a sterile research environment where I could dedicate myself entirely to the study of Cordon and the Harlequins. I failed out of my mythology program not because I stopped studying, but because I was studying a subject no university dared to acknowledge. I was no longer a student. I was an archivist of the apocalypse. My research confirmed the terrifying nature of the Harlequins. They were not human, not precisely. They were vestiges, human bodies possessed by the ancient, dry spirits of the cult's original members, bound to the cycle of the risus tenebrarum. Their aim was to harvest not life, but joy, forcing their victims to trade their sanity for an eternal, agonizing joke. They were the lonely ones, constantly seeking to fill the void of their own dead souls with the broken laughter of new converts. The texts I found were explicit. The Harlequins were always drawn to places of forgotten history and suppressed tragedy. Places like Blackwood Cove, founded on the dark rituals of desperate settlers and the blood of the land's original inhabitants. And they were heralds. Their activity, the intense, localized terror designed to break the will, always preceded the coming of Cordon. Cordon, the entity, was not a god but a concept, the embodiment of all cynical, desperate, self-mocking laughter. It was the eternal audience and the ultimate jest, destined to consume the world in a wave of terrifying, joyless conversion. The only thing that kept me sane during those months of frantic research was the continued presence of my two friends, Finn and Sarah. The fracture of the trio. Sarah and Lily healed the best, physically. Lily Sorensen, after months of therapy, eventually started speaking again, but she never recovered her spirit. She was withdrawn, quiet, and lived in constant, paralyzing fear of the dark. Her parents moved her out of Blackwood Cove entirely, seeking a place where the shadows weren't so deep. Sarah, my closest friend, struggled with a different kind of injury. Guilt. She felt responsible for not recognizing Lily sooner, and for her initial moment of panic. She was also profoundly disturbed by the unsettling retreat of the mocker. She became obsessed with the idea of a final confrontation, often asking me, "Why did she run, Elias? Why didn't she follow us? Did she know we'd come back?" I never told her the mocker was heartbroken, not merely defeated. I couldn't bear to tell her that the Harlequins craved her soul more than her death. But the most tragic collapse was Finn's. Finn, the one who took a life to save ours, was utterly destroyed by the experience. He had killed the sentinel cleanly, decisively, and his first reaction was fierce, protective pride. But that pride soured almost immediately into a toxic combination of trauma and suspicion. The police had covered up the truth about the sentinel's body, classifying the death as self-defense against a masked vagrant. But Finn couldn't forget the smell of sulfur and the tar-like blood. He started to believe the Harlequins were not just random killers but an organized military force, and that by killing one, he had entered an unwinnable global war. He became withdrawn, hostile, and utterly consumed by the notion of retaliation. He refused to let the hatchet go, keeping it honed and strapped to his leg at all times. He started hoarding weapons, studying survivalist manuals, and constantly patrolling the edges of the Blackwood, searching for any sign of their return. His paranoia wasn't unfounded, but his methods were suicidal. One evening, about 6 months after the monolith incident, Finn cornered me in my cabin. He was shaking, his eyes wide and bloodshot from lack of sleep. "They're coming back, Elias. I can hear them," he hissed, pacing my small living space. "Not the laughter, not the giggle. I hear the whistling." I immediately recognized the reference. The thin, high, piercing sound reported by the lighthouse keeper just before her dog vanished. The sound of the Harlequin's summoning. Finn, calm down. The whistling is just a summoning sound. We need to stay inside, barricade the door and— No, you don't get it, Elias. We have to go after them, he interrupted, grabbing the strap of his hatchet. I saw one tonight, near the old cannery. The grinner, I think. He was setting up something. He was waiting. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for validation. We hit them hard last time, Elias. We showed them we wouldn't laugh. We can end this here. We can end Cordon before it starts. I tried to reason with him. I tried to use my extensive research as a shield. I argued that the Jocular Order could not be fought with mere brute force. They were metaphysical creatures, bound by strange ancient rules. Their power was derived from the psychological space of fear and loneliness, not conventional means. They only retreated because of the joy and connection, Mrs. Du Bois's maternal alarm, that countered their desolate nature. But Finn wasn't listening to logic anymore. He was listening to the voice of trauma, demanding an end to his suffering. He was listening to the loneliness of the man he'd killed, and he needed to prove that loneliness was a lie. They are waiting for me, Elias. I killed their friend. I'm the one who needs to go, he stated, his voice flat with fatalistic determination. He left before I could stop him, plunging into the dense, starless black of the Blackwood. I immediately called Sarah. I didn't mince words. I simply told her that Finn was going back to the monolith, and he was armed. Sarah, knowing Finn's volatile state, agreed instantly to meet me. We knew we had to save him, not from the Harlequins, but from his own desperate, suicidal courage. The final jest. Sarah and I met at the Red Maple, taking only two things. A heavy-duty flashlight, pure, white light was the only thing that had made the mocker retreat, and a full tank of gasoline we grabbed from Sarah's dad's shed. My knowledge of the Harlequin lore had uncovered one critical weakness: fire. Since they were desiccated, ancient vests of life, the cleansing, consuming nature of fire was the only thing capable of permanently destroying a Harlequin. We ran the trail faster than we ever had, the flashlight beam cutting a desperate swath through the oppressive, silent gloom. The moment we reached the monolith clearing, we stopped, paralyzed by a sight more horrifying than the skulls and the blood. Finn was there, but he wasn't fighting. He was standing perfectly still, his back to us, facing the monolith. The hatchet lay forgotten on the ground behind him, and surrounding him were not 3, but 7 Harlequins, a veritable gathering of the Jocular Order. They were all shapes and sizes, wearing every kind of ancient, rotting motley imaginable. Some bright, some dull, some with patched leather, others with faded velvet. They all had the same terrifying, frozen, ecstatic smiles carved into their masks. The mocker and the grinner were among them, standing closest to Finn, and they were all giggling. The sound was a collective, dry, insect-like noise, the risus tenebrarum amplified 7-fold, a wall of pure, cynical auditory torment. Finn stood in the center of the circle, his shoulders slumped, his entire posture radiating defeat. "Finn, run!" Sarah screamed, her voice cracking as she raised the flashlight, bathing the scene in a flood of pure white light. The light stopped the Harlequins cold. They winced, raising their hands to shield their masks, and the giggling instantly subsided into an angry, low hissing. The mocker turned her stitched mask toward Sarah, and her voice, the sickeningly sweet voice, cut through the momentary silence. "The little companion returns. Did you come to laugh with us, dear? We saved a place for you." The grinner took a step toward Finn, and that's when I saw it. On Finn's back, near his left shoulder, there was a grotesque, shimmering tattoo of a single bright crimson tear. It was fresh, glossy, and pulsed faintly with a dark, inner light. It was the mark of the dark jest. They hadn't killed him, they had claimed him. Before I could process the meaning of that mark, Finn turned to face us. His face was bare. He wasn't wearing a mask, but his features were smeared with thick, grotesque white paint, crisscrossed by the cobalt streaks of Harlequin tears. His eyes were wide, dilated, and terrifyingly vacant, identical to the dead eyes I had seen through the mask of the Sentinel. He looked right at Sarah, his beloved friend, and smiled. It was a fixed, impossibly wide, silent smile that did not reach his eyes. It was the grinner's smile, now worn by Finn O'Connell. And then, Finn spoke, his voice no longer the furious tenor of my friend, but a dry, rattling, joyless parody. "It's not funny, Elias. It's never funny." He took a slow step towards us, his movements the same stilted, unnatural gait I had seen in the initial sightings. "But the dark is lonely, and Cordon is coming. We need more friends to share the punchline with us. Come laugh, Elias. You promised you would play." My heart cracked open with a pain far sharper than any knife. My friend was gone, converted, already a vessel for the Jocular Order. Sarah, however, didn't flinch. She had come prepared to save Finn, and she hadn't given up. She slammed the flashlight onto the ground, pointing the beam directly at the Harlequins, then screamed one single, desperate word at the top of her lungs. "Fire!" I understood instantly. The can of gasoline. I grabbed it, ripped the cap off, and began swinging the can wildly, soaking Finn and the Harlequins closest to him in the fuel. The sickly sweet smell of the gasoline cut through the sulfur and the pine needles. The Harlequins screamed in terror, a truly human, terrified sound this time. They hated the light, but they feared the fire. They tried to back away, to scramble into the shadows, but the circle of the monolith clearing was now a trap. Finn, my friend, the Harlequin vestige, stood perfectly still, seemingly oblivious, his empty smile frozen in place. I grabbed the heavy-duty lighter I always kept for camping. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped it, but I managed to flip the wheel. The sudden, violent eruption of the tiny flame was a majestic, beautiful thing. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the lighter onto the fuel-soaked ground between myself and Finn. The gasoline ignited with a terrifying, thunderous whoosh, creating a towering, blinding curtain of cleansing orange fire. The Harlequins shrieked, a chorus of agony that sounded like centuries of dust and dry bone burning. They collapsed, dissolving instantly into piles of black, sulfurous dust. The mocker and the grinner were consumed instantly, reduced to ash before they could escape the circle of fire. But Finn, my friend, the vessel, stood in the center of the inferno. He didn't burn immediately. The fire wrapped around him like a violent, protective shroud, and for one final, agonizing second, the thick white makeup on his face cracked open. I saw a fleeting, impossible flash of recognition, a flicker of true human sorrow in his eyes. And then, before the flames completely consumed him, Finn O'Connell, the Harlequin's newest convert, let out one last, terrible sound. It wasn't laughter. It was a single, piercing, heartbreaking sob. He was immediately reduced to a pile of black, smoldering ash, indistinguishable from the other vestiges. Sarah and I stood at the edge of the inferno, the heat blistering our faces, tears streaming down our cheeks. The Harlequins were gone. The fire had taken them all. Cordon's legacy. We didn't call the police. We couldn't. We cleaned up the monolith clearing ourselves, scattering the ashes of the Jocular Order into the wind and the surrounding Blackwood. The fire had burned hot and fast, leaving only a patch of scorched earth and the overwhelming scent of ash and pine. We never told anyone the truth. We reported Finn as a missing person, a casualty of his own post-traumatic isolation. The police searched, but Blackwood Cove keeps its secrets well. Chief leads never ask too many questions. filing the case away under the heading of a town tragedy. Sarah and I are the only ones left. The only ones who know the truth of the Jocular Order and the coming of Cordon. 3 years later, I am still researching. I now track the global movements of the Harlequins, observing the patterns of their laugh torture and their desperate recruitment drives. They still surface, fleetingly, in forgotten corners of the world, trying to coerce their victims into the dark jest. The news calls them pranks. I call them missionaries. I wrote this account not for history, but as a warning. The Harlequins are lonely, and they are recruiting. They want you to join their eternal, awful joke. The moment you lose your sanity to their despair, the moment you force that final, bitter, cynical laugh from yourself, you become one of them. You become a vessel, another broken soul desperate for company. The only defense against Cordon is not strength, not violence, but the stubborn refusal to descend into their specific brand of madness. I am Elias Vance, and I have lost my home, my education, and my best friend to this endless, sick joke. I live in the light, but I study the darkness. And every night, when the winds blow cold through the pines of Blackwood Cove, I hear the high, thin sound of a summoning. They are whistling, and I know, with cold certainty, that the laughter of the malevolent will soon return.